Hey guys, I have finally read my first Dune book, and I heard from a lot of its fans over the years that it has influenced the Star Wars in a major way. Now, I wanted to check it out for myself, so stick around and find out how much of Star Wars is really influenced by Dune, or if I think the two are completely different worlds. Let's check it out. Where should I start reading? What is canon versus legends? When does the story begin? The answers to these questions is right here on Star Wars Timeline. Okay guys, here we are. And before we start talking about Dune and comparing it to Star Wars and drawing some sorts of parallels, I just want to give you a quick heads up what you can expect from this video. I briefly want to mention that this is not going to be some sort of an academic professional review of one work and comparison to another. I'm not going to pull up some historical archival research or do some search for some kind of quotes. This is just an impression of one fan. Now, I always knew for decades long who Frank Herbert is, and that the Dune is one of the major pillars of science fiction, and it's beloved across the world. And obviously, we all know the Star Wars films and George Lucas, how he started making his film in 1975, and 2 years later we got the movie. And I also was as a kid a fan of the Dune movie, watching it back in Russia in the 80s. So I also knew about the source from that movie, although I'm hearing from a lot of fans that is not very representative of that. So expect just a fan reaction from a person who read Dune, and I read a lot of hardcore science fiction, a lot of epic fantasy. So I think I know my way around storytelling to be able to compare the two and tell you what my personal thoughts are and how much of Star Wars is really influenced by Dune. And I want to break it down into sections so you guys can follow me easily, and the discussion is very clear to follow. So we actually look at specific things in the book and we compare it to very specific things in the movie. And for the sake of this video, I only want to use the original Star Wars film, A New Hope, because obviously that's the clearest way you can take a look at both and say, okay, what's the comparison here? Now, I also understand that Dune was followed up by other books by the original author and continued on by his son and other authors. So only using the original Dune book and only using the first Star Wars film. I want to look at some central themes of both and make some comparisons there. I want to look at the overall setting of both. I want to take a look at the story and the style that it's written in. And lastly, I want to take a look at the characters. Now, let's jump into it and take a look at some of the central themes. What is Dune? First and foremost, obviously, its main protagonist, Paul Atreides, it's a story of coming of age. And obviously, there's a great connection to Star Wars because we see young Luke Skywalker. It is also a coming of age story. Now, how they go about it is quite different. The plot structure is different. The type of protagonists they are. One is comes from an important house of royalty, not royalty, but a dukedom, and he's very well versed in the martial arts and different disciplines. And Luke is just so to speak, a village bumpkin from a distant planet of Tatooine. The next central theme is the Imperial control. Yes, we have the Empire in Dune, and we have the Padishah Emperor Shadim IV, who is basically extending his rule over the rest of the known galaxy, including the main world of Arrakis where the story takes place. And we also have the Empire in the original film. Even though most of it is in the background, we never see the Imperial worlds, we never see its emperor. We see it personified through, of course, Darth Vader and its military campaign with Governor Tarkin and, of course, the Death Star. Also, Dune has some sort of resistance to tyranny through its freedom fighters, or what they're literally called the Freemen, which also draws parallels with Star Wars. And we also have some sort of a rebellion. We have Luke join the rebel fight. He meets, Leia, and they reveal the plans to the Death Star, and they go about and destroying it. And one of the other central themes, which George Lucas has very much expressed in numerous interviews, and we see it in Dune, is nature versus technology. Now, we are introduced to this major world of Arrakis, where we see the native freemen populating this desert world and trying to conserve as much water as possible. And they're basically reaping the any minuscule rewards this planet is willing to give them. And their fight is against a very technologically advanced people, soldiers of the Emperor, the Sardaukar. They have shields, they have omnithopters, these flying machines, they have battleships. So there's a clear distinction of nature versus technology. And of course, we see that in the original Star Wars film. We see Luke Skywalker, who comes from a very distant world of Tatooine. And also we see partially a bit of Yavin 4 and very, very quick shot of its green jungles and stuff like that. And of course, this is where all the rebellion X-Wing ships fly off to fight the technological terror that the Empire has devised, the Death Star. So there are some general comparisons in the themes, but I would argue that they're distinct enough, and the comparison or parallel is so loose because you can find so many of these common themes in other science fiction that came way before both of these books and is popular today in other modern novels. Let's take a look at the next feature, which is the setting. But before, I'm going to take a quick sip of water. There's a lot to cover. Feels good. Water is life. That's what they say on Arrakis. By the way, I just got to mention that it was a tremendous read. Reading Dune was really, really awesome. And of course, just like the rest of you, I was so hyped by the second trailer, which is completely magnificent. And, it pushed me on reading this book. But also, I really wanted to get to the nitty and gritty of it and understand what the Dune fans are saying. Like, how much is there of Dune in the Star Wars franchise? Now, let's talk about the setting. We begin on an ocean world of Caladan. This is where Paul Atreides, Duke Leto, is overseeing that planet. And then we go to the desert world of Arrakis. In Star Wars, the setting is similar as well. We start actually on the ship, Tantive 4. So we're actually in outer space. And then we go to Tatooine, also a desert world. And then we go to Death Star. Again, this technological machinery, and it's so clean and pristine and devoid of any kind of life. And we also see a little bit of Yavin 4, as I mentioned. So while the setting of Dune is arguably the Arrakis, this is where a major portion of the story takes place. This is where all the Freemen are. This is where the house of Leto is being completely devastated. And this is where young hero Paul Atreides goes, and meets the natives and interacts with them. And this is where the major fight against the Empire takes place. Star Wars is not similar in that regard. It doesn't have one total setting. You can't say it's Tatooine. Yes, some part of the story takes place there, but then we move on. It's an adventure story, and we visit different places. Also, in terms of setting, it is almost alluded to, or at least what I'm gathering from, and guys, please be patient with me. I've only read one book so far. I don't know, the details of the future titles, but based on the first book, there's some connection to Earth. It feels like it takes place in a far, far distant future where humans have learned to colonize different planets, versus Star Wars, which is clearly not our galaxy. It takes place literally a galaxy far, far away. And the biggest giveaway is that in the Dune book, we're dealing predominantly with human. Even the Freemen that we meet on the planet of Arrakis, they're people that have been basically affected in one way or the other by the spice. And they have these, blue eyes. And of course, you have different factions like the Bene Gesserit, the female faction of these wizards or magicians, which almost feel like advanced humans. But still, there's a lot of terminology like the Holy Jihad and the Holy Church of Orange Bible, something like this. Comparisons and overtures to very, very familiar concepts that we have in our real world today. So almost the books makes you believe that, we are the past. We're living in the past of this book's lore. And Dune events transpire thousands upon thousands of years in the future, but there's still this connection to real world. Star Wars doesn't have that. Completely different in that regard. So that's all I wanted to mention in terms of setting, because when we're going to talk about setting from the standpoint of story, we're going to move on to the next segment. And actually, that's actually where I want to make most of my comparison. This is story and style. And let's, of course, begin with Dune. The style. Dune or at least to me, the way I interpreted the story is it's very first of all, it's a cerebral political thriller. You have three major factions vying for power. You have the House of Harkonnen, you have the House of Atreides, and you have the House of Sardaukar, and of course the Emperor is standing there on the side. So it's a strife and a political game between three major factions. Star Wars is very different stylistically here. It's a swashbuckling adventure, something very, very akin to the Robin Hood adventure stories and the movie that we got, I believe, what is it, with Errol Flint, early 30s. So that's what it is. It is also a modern myth, and it's basically, it depends a lot on adventures, action, and thrill, versus Dune, which is a lot more brooding. It's a lot more cerebral and intellectual, and there's different themes going on there. There's a lot of package to unravel and take a look at, versus Star Wars, which is very straightforward. You have a young hero, he sees what this empire is doing, and he's there to fight it. A call to action, a hero is there, he answers the call, and he defeats the empire. Very simple stuff. And it's not to say that one is better than the other. There's a place for books that are, and stories that are cerebral and kind of make you think and have that lasting effect in that regard. And then you have something simple that concentrates and focuses on its main hero and his feelings and emotions and the fight that he wants to do. And it has that appeal in a completely different way. There's an argument to be said that people say the most memorable stories across centuries are the simple ones, because that's what people gravitate to. They're easy to understand and digest and to teach to kids as a learning lesson of life. Another stylistic choice or story device that we see in Dune is going native. And it's something that we see in movies like Dances with Wolves, The Last Samurai, and James Cameron's Avatar. It's where the main hero lands on a planet, whether it's a planet of his enemies or a planet of somebody he's not very knowledgeable about, and he starts learning their culture and becomes part of their culture and starts opposing the influence of his own people on that culture. So that's the going native theme. In Star Wars Episode 4, it's quite different. It's a very black and white story of good versus evil. We know who the good guys are, we know who the bad guys are, and all the hero has to do is pick up the sword, or in Luke's respect, jump into that X-fighter and fight the bad guys. Dune has a lot of philosophy. That's who the Frank Herbert, the author, is. He was known to be this very, very intellectual person, very well-read, and it seeps through the pages of this book, Dune. You see philosophy, you see the commentary on human condition and war, how people who have adapted in a very harsh environments like the Iraqis here, he almost compares them to the Arabic mujahideen, people who live and survive in the deserts and know the terrain so well that when a more technologically advanced culture comes to invade them, or fight them, like the United States or Soviet Union during the Cold War era, these people have the upper hand because they know their land. And of course, in the Star Wars Episode 4, George Lucas has openly stated that it's a commentary on the Vietnam War. But aside from the fact that, okay, yes, there is a technologically advanced empire, this entity who is trying to subjugate the rest of the planets, we don't delve a lot into it. It is very, very on the surface. It is all represented in this very symbological, terrifying thing, which is a Death Star. You see this huge globe floating through space, and it represents danger, and it represents oppression, and these, the Imperialists walking in these uniforms, which are obviously very reminiscent of the Nazi German uniforms of the SS and so forth. And when you look at the stormtroopers and their helmets, obviously, of course, Darth Vader as well, it's easy to draw a parallel to Nazi Germany. But in terms of delving deep into it, I wouldn't say that Star Wars does a lot of parallel in that respect. It's very general themes of advanced and overpowering culture versus somebody who is, underwhelmed like the rebels. The next thing I want to cover is that the Dune, the book, I would argue that its main attraction here and its main pillar is actually world building and lore. And let me explain that. They take the stage here because there's a lot of musings and setups for, first of all, explaining what came before the past, of the Ben Gesserit and what their objectives were and why they needed to breed, Jessica with a particular kind of duke to produce as some sort of kind of son. So there's a lot of plotting that you kind of could understand it happened in its distant past. And the book also concerns itself very much with the future. I mean, when you talk about Paul himself, there's a lot of visions that he has. There's a lot of this. He's very, very concerned and worried about this holy jihad, this holy war that his soldiers, his freemen, will eventually wreak upon the galaxy because they have been controlled by the Empire and they will not have it anymore. Give me just a second, guys. Like I said, Dune and water. It sort of makes sense. There we go. We can continue now. So it's and even its characters, as a reader, I felt very aloof and I didn't make as much of a connection to the Dune characters. Not because they're poorly done. No. Let me make it very clear to you guys. The motivations of each Dune character is very well defined and we understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. But I felt that it was Frank Herbert's artistic choice to distance the reader, or at least that's how I felt, from its characters, because there's almost feels like there is greater forces at play here. And this question of destiny, which is obviously a huge mythological question that Star Wars also addresses, but here it's very clearly defined that there's some powers at play that not even Paul Atreides will be able to control in the future. Things are just transpiring as destiny wills, and the heroes are being nudged in that direction. Again, as I read the book chapter by chapter, I felt that there's a hand of destiny. And, the Princess Iluran, who is the daughter of the Padishah Emperor, she kind of like chronicles and explains what happened after the fact, how, Paul Atreides came to power and how things happened. But there's always this world building and rich lore and things happening in the backgrounds which control the central plot, which was very surprising and actually quite interesting to me. That's not a critique at all. It's just a different way to tell a story. And I have to give out the shout out to the author, Frank Herbert, and first of all, say thank you for such an amazing novel where he deliberately chose to tell a story in a different manner from I personally would have expected. And I see the appeal of this book. I see why people praise it so much because from artistic standpoint, it's marvelous. It's so well written. Now back to Star Wars. I mentioned that, it's a swashbuckling adventure and it solely depends on its characters. There's not a lot of things going on in the way of lore other than the fact that we know, okay, there's an empire, it's evil, and then again, we're talking about just episode 4. There's an evil empire, it subjugates and it bullies other, worlds and lesser, able cultures, and that's all there is to it. And then there is a rebellion that fights it. And of course the Jedi, these Jedi who were trying to preserve the old Republic, and they were defeated. It's very simple stuff. And once again, it is not a critique, it's a distinction from Dune. This is where I don't see how Dune has artistically or thematically influenced Star Wars, because they're very, very different. We have Luke, Han, Leia, and arguably, of course, Obi-Wan Kenobi as a mentor. They're the centerpiece of the story. It's a very character-centric film, and it concerns itself mostly with here and now. There's not a lot of stuff that the days of yore and how things were. Even though there's a little tiny scene where Kenobi talks about there was a clone war and that's what the Jedi fought, and and that's who your father was. It's minuscule. It's very little. The main premise, all of the drama revolves around what is going to happen now. What is Luke going to do about this empire? Is he going to help Obi-Wan Kenobi? Are they going to retrieve the plans? Are they going to destroy the Death Star? It's here. It's in the moment. Versus Dune, once again, which I found very intriguing, it's jumping around all the time. There's a lot of things in the past, and I know that there's books exist about the young Leto Atreides, and I actually want to check it out. And of course, it's going to flesh out the world, but it's not fair to talk about the future, titles. I only want to talk about the first book because it is the most impactful. It is the most known around the world. So we talked about a little bit storyline and themes, which once again I don't believe that are two very comparable. Uh, Dune is an entirely different animal. It operates on different story mechanics, so to speak. And Star Wars, it's basically a simple modern myth akin to something like a one, heroic deed of Hercules presented here, on screen. And the last segment that I want to talk about is the characters, because I think that's the clearest way that you could make a comparison and say like, oh, okay, so this is the Dune character that somehow George Lucas has rewrote, was influenced by, and there is some character beats that he's going to put in Star Wars, and that's where the influence is. So let's take a look at a couple of them. I'm going to mention the characters that felt the most fleshed out and the most prominent and drove the story in Dune, and compare them to the Star Wars. The first one is, I want to talk about both Leto Atreides and his son Paul, because they have a relationship in the story. There's a father and son dynamic going on there, and Leto Atreides invests a lot of his time into following with the Emperor's rule and going to this planet Arrakis and trying to make it work, and develop all the spies and take full control over it and be a good governor, be a good leader. And he also has some sort of a rapport with his son. He's a bit of a mentor to him, even though his mother, Jessica, which I'll mention later, he's much more of a mentor to him as well. It's a kind of dynamic that we don't see in Star Wars. Because when we come to Luke Skywalker, who is its main hero, he has no father. He has a father figure, but he doesn't have any sort of relationship to his father the way that Paul Atreides does. We know that Obi-Wan Kenobi relates to him who his father was. And let's not jump into episode 5 and 6 where, the story evolves and eventually Darth Vader becomes his father. We don't know that yet in episode 4. When the credits roll, all the audience knows is that Luke Skywalker's father was a hero who fought in the Clone Wars, and he died for a good cause. It's sort of similar with Leto Atreides, who is also, he's part of this group who opposes the Empire, and he dies for a good cause. But it's very, very different because Leto comes from a duke. He's a duke. He's a very influential person. His house is very influential. It was part of the Empire, actually. And when he goes there, he doesn't just fight the Emperor on some kind of like idealistic crusade on that ground. He fights because he feels that his own house is being threatened. That's very, very different from what Luke Skywalker's father has done. And also Luke as the main hero. The only father figure that he has is Obi-Wan Kenobi. And it's very, very different. Again, I will link Kenobi to actually somebody else there. But from that standpoint, Paul Atreides, Luke Skywalker, Anakin Skywalker, Leto, very, very different. I don't see a comparison there at all. Next, let's talk about Jessica. She is part of this Ben Gesserit faction that only females are permitted into it, and they're trained in the ways of seeing, some kind of voice abilities that are able to manipulate other people, which sort of kind of, I guess, a comparisons to the Force, even though it's different, that not every person can fall into it, and I don't think it's based on how intellectual or dim-witted the person is as they are in Star Wars. This is how Obi-Wan Kenobi was able to control those stormtroopers, because they're not very smart. Once again, the only other female character we have in Star Wars that we can possibly connect to Jessica is Leia, a senator from Alderaan. Now, yes, she's also from an influential faction of senators, and she states so clearly in the film, but she has no powers, and she doesn't exert any kind of control over the main hero, Luke Skywalker, the same way that Jessica does on Paul. She is the mother figure. She's the mentor in the way of speech, that basically that wizardry that these Ben Gesserit are capable of doing. She teaches that to Paul, and she kind of puts him on a path that he will be a successful ruler. None of these themes or character beats are in Star Wars. Leia is as much of a victim of the Empire as the Luke Skywalker is, and they all depend on each other. Nobody has kind of like mentorship relationship to one another. If anything, the only thing Luke Skywalker has, he has a crush on Leia. Again, very different. There's no comparable character like that in Dune. In Dune, we have somebody who is Chani, a young female freeman who, once again, is capable but very different from Leia. She's a native, and she's there, who comes and becomes part of Paul Atreides' clan and his beloved, because that's what he saw in the future. Again, vastly different from Luke. No comparison there. I would say actually that Obi-Wan Kenobi is a lot closer to Jessica than Leia is, even though he's a male character. Perhaps that if we were to say that George Lucas was kind of influenced by Dune, he would take that idea of Ben Gesserit and their influence on other people, this kind of like subtle magical use, and he kind of like puts it in Star Wars, even though that there are other sources state that George Lucas were influenced by like the Indian cultures and the yogi. That's why he gave Yoda that name, which is very kind of like Yods in very similar themes. And also, that they're able to control their bodies and project that energy, the ki, or open up your chakras. I don't know how much of a influence Dune really has based on just reading the book and looking at the movie. Now, the most intriguing, the most fleshed out character, the most colorful character in Dune is arguably Vladimir Harkonnen, the grand villain. He's this very conniving, highly intelligent, highly brutal person who will stop at nothing than grab more power. That's his biggest vice. He's not after just money. He thrives on and he lives for controlling other people. And he enjoys, he's like a sadist as well. He enjoys inflicting pain. There's some allusion to little boys that he constantly has a rotation of. He's like a very unlikable character, but it was fun to watch and follow how smart, how much of a sly fox he is. There is no comparison to him in Star Wars. We also have a villain in Darth Vader, but he's an entirely different type of animal. He is not a shrewd politician as Vladimir is. He is not an espionage tactician. He doesn't have people or with his hands on everything and controlling and manipulating people from that regard as Vladimir Harkonnen is. Vader is very hands-on. He's basically a dark knight. He's there like, okay, this is the problem. These are the rebels. Let's go and take the plans back. Let's kill the rebellion on Yavin 4 before they are able to damage the Death Star. Very different dynamic from him. He's very straightforward bad guy, and I would actually say that not to the detriment of Star Wars, just for the style of storytelling that he is. He's a very straightforward villain. It's not until episode 5 and 6 where we see him fully fleshed out as you might say, the character. In episode 4, he's deliberately this shapeless, like formless, dark shape. You can't put a face to him. You don't understand what drives him, but there's something that clearly does drive him. And he clearly wants to destroy Obi-Wan Kenobi because of their shared past. Again, I'm not going into prequels and all of the added lore and story that we get later on. I'm just solely looking at it from a standpoint of one film. So Vader and Vladimir Harkonnen, very different. We also know that obviously Vader, the name itself, George Lucas took from the German. Vader means father or something like this. And the last but not least, I want to talk about Stilgar, one of the Freeman leader who basically becomes sort of a mentor to Paul Atreides. He teaches them in the ways of the Freemen. He helps them go native and observe of the cultures and rituals and how to get the respect and love of the native peoples. Once again, I see a little bit of Obi-Wan Kenobi there. But once again, Stilgar from the Dune book, he doesn't possess any kind of magic powers. He can't overpower Paul Atreides. Paul Atreides is a young guy. He's, I think by the end of the book, he's like 18 years old. But physically and in terms of like combat, he supersedes Stilgar. What Stilgar is valuable for is the wisdom lessons that he imparts on the young hero. And that's what Obi-Wan Kenobi also does to young Luke Skywalker. And before I draw a conclusion and give you my final thoughts, here's a little bonus. And as I was finishing the book, there's a little afterwards by the Frank Herbert's son, Brian Herbert, celebrating the success of the book and how it was written and so forth. he also mentions the main hero, uh, Paul Atreides Muad'Dib, where he becomes this seer, this larger than life figure. And he says that in the future books, a lot of Dune fans were not favorable to Paul's evolution as character, because Frank Herbert, the author, always had in mind of showing both good and later on the bad side of the same hero. You could almost say it's like Luke Skywalker and Anakin Skywalker all rolled up into one character. And I found that really, really interesting because it parallels what is happening today with the Star Wars sequels, and particularly The Last Jedi portrayal of Luke Skywalker. I just found a lot of answers and honestly a lot of resonance with a very intellectual author was doing with his book back in 1965. He was subverting expectations, he was upsetting the formula, and he said, look, my characters are not going to be stuck in the same kind of routines that they were doing as young people. If I'm going to continue the story of Paul Atreides and his accomplishments, we also have to take a look at his other side, his darker side. And it's even alluded here in the original book where Paul is always looking at the possible future of the jihad, where they will go and wage this bloody, bloody war across the galaxy. And I just found that very, very appealing, and it makes me eager to start reading other Dune books. And it's something that I completely was welcomed and was actually quite moved by, to see a Luke Skywalker in episode 8 the way that I've never possibly could have perceived. You know, I've read a lot of Legends books, and we all know who Luke Skywalker is as a hero. But Rian Johnson was able to take that character and put a twist on him and say, what if Luke Skywalker was put in this very, very hard position? How would he become? So there I saw like a small little parallel with the Dune books here, and that's the reason I wanted to mention it. Now, here's my closing thoughts. Is Star Wars influenced by the Dune? I would say if it was, then in a very, very minor ways. You know, you have one desert world of Arrakis in Dune, and you have one desert world in Star Wars Tatooine. And that's honestly the biggest connection that I could make. And the reason that you would have something like a desert world, it's not just for cool aesthetic or visuals. You know, sometimes the setting is the character itself. It puts a theme to the story of what you want to try to say, that Luke Skywalker, he's in the middle of nowhere. This place is boring. Nothing is happening here. It's lifeless. I want to go out there and experience life and vitality of it and become a somebody. And that's to me what the Tatooine says specifically in episode 4. In Dune, Arrakis is a lot deeper. There's so much involved with it. How it shapes people into this harsh fighting force because they are exposed to these extreme situations. How they're able to control its native species of these huge worms, and how the spices there completely different. It without Arrakis, I would say you don't have a Dune book. And in Star Wars, the Tatooine, possibly not as well, but there's so much more to the Star Wars movie than just Tatooine, because we go off of there. The point and premise of the Star Wars Episode 4 is to go from point A to point B. And I felt like reading Dune, the idea was to build this huge universe that you get a sense of what was, and you have a sense of where it's going to go. And you see how its characters are being manipulated and puppeteered by these kind of like larger events. Very completely two different storytelling styles, completely different heroes, completely different setting. So no, I would not say that Star Wars was influenced by Dune in any great way, even though it came before. And of course, I don't know the full story. I don't know George Lucas's background. Who knows? Maybe I'm completely wrong. If you guys have any information, or you would like to impart to me some knowledge or some kind of resources I could check out, I would gladly check them. And, you know, I would be, if corrected, I would gladly say it like, hey guys, I didn't know this. Is pretty exciting. Before I close off this video, I just wanted to quickly mention that this is not the last comparison I wanted to make. This is actually a part 1 video of 2-part segment that I wanted to do. And here's the reason why. Here's another book. Edgar Rice Burroughs' The Martian Tales, the John Carter of Mars. Now, this is also, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, one of the most celebrated science fiction books of all time. Edgar Rice Burroughs is considered one of the fathers of modern science fiction. Him and Edgar Wells together, and of course before them Jules Verne. But the stuff that he was doing in the John Carter of Mars, the original novel, there's a lot of comparisons I could make to the Star Wars film, Episode 4, and even the future movies. And if you guys stick around and come in, I'll possibly do a video next week comparing the other two and how actually the John Carter of Mars has also clearly influenced Dune. Maybe I'll get to talk about the Edgar Rice Burroughs and George Lucas and somehow try to squeeze the Dune book in between. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts about it. I immensely enjoyed reading Dune, and I'm going to push on with that series. And hopefully, as many fans say, the movie will turn out to be the cerebral, intellectual Star Wars movie for adults we always wanted the sequels to be. Anyway, my name is Benjamin. I do Star Wars comic book and book reviews, character highlights, lore videos, podcasts. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I would really appreciate your support. Hit that bell button so you don't miss my cool future videos. And I'll see you all later.